Good morning, my dears. This is Miss Zaret coming to you before I leave for my trip to talk about Victorian London. Victorian London is so named, or Victorian England gets its name from the monarch, Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 as a young woman and reigned until her death in the 20th century. So she was up until our recently deceased queen, she was the longest reigning monarch. And the Victorian era, and London in particular, is a place of contrasts, a place where people present a public face that is moral and upright and good by the terms of the century, but there's a seamy underbelly. People have a shadow self. The shadow archetype is going to be very important for Jekyll and Hyde, for our book that we are reading, because people have this public face that behaves morally and behaves one way, and then they have this shadow side that behaves in a different way, and so you have some hypocrisy, certainly. So at the beginning of the 19th century, so remember that's 1800s, because the year 0 to the year 99 CE or AD is the first century. So that's why we subtract 1. So beginning of the 1800s, the population of London is 1 million people, which is a lot. But by the beginning of the 20th century, it's close to 6 million, which is huge. It's the heart of the trade, the global trade market, and you have rich people. You have two huge categories, but the rich people, very small in number, extremely large in power, and you have millions of poor people in London. London also became the entertainment capital. You have bawdy shows, salacious parties. So you have more prostitutes in London at this time than at any other time. And you have, just all kinds of drinking, gambling dens. This is a time when if you were a rich white guy, you could have that bachelor lifestyle, right? Even if you were married, married men had mistresses and all kinds of scandalous behavior that was simply kept out of the press. Soho and other areas became a melting pot for rich people looking for a little walk on the wild side, right? Checking out the dark side, and the poor hoping to get lucky. All those prostitutes that I mentioned, right? So, Victorian London, a place of contradictions. Stevenson, Robert Louis Stevenson, our author of Jekyll and Hyde, describes London as this place of great contrast. So our characters Utterson and Enfield, they are walking the streets, and we see both sides of the city. They pass through rich, affluent, busy streets, which have an air of invitation. It's like, oh, you want to stay here, like rows of smiling saleswomen, and a general cleanliness. However, as they turn the corner, the scene changes dramatically. Here they pass buildings without windows, which bore the marks of prolonged and sordid neglect, where tramps slouched into recesses and unruly children vandalized the buildings. Stephen uses contrast throughout the story to convey places and people and to explore themes of duality and human nature. So that double side to everyone, that everyone has contrast, yin and yang, if you will, but in an unhealthy way. Religion and science. I wrote a paper about Dracula, which was written in 1897, also taking place partly in London. In grad school, I wrote it, and Dracula is the sum of all Victorian fears. And these Victorians were intrigued by science, but they were also terrified of it because of the perceived clash between science and religion. So Jekyll and Hyde was published a little bit earlier in 1886, and Stevenson was 36 years old. And like many writers of that century, many intellectuals, he was profoundly influenced by Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species. In 1859, Darwin introduced the theory of evolution, where he said that all life, including humans, had evolved over millions of years. The book was and still is extremely controversial, and many people see it as an attack on religion. This is a time when science and religion are truly beginning to be at odds with each other. In earlier centuries, they had worked together, but now you see science making claims that go against religious beliefs. So people are concerned also that science is meddling where only God has control, should have control. Like an earlier work, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is very much about the warnings of what happens when man tries to play God. And we see that definitely in Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is a maverick, a rebel scientist. He keeps pushing the limits to see how far can I go? What can I do? And predictably, he has disastrous results. So that boundary between what is science and what is supernatural is pushed in Jekyll and Hyde. Nature versus the supernatural. In the Victorian era, you have science and religion, but you also have humanity in constant conflict. Humans have a dual nature. Some people are calm and rational, but we have those dark, deep fantasies of violence and murder and sex and nightmares, and the rational versus the irrational. Your logical brain versus your what Freud would call the id, what Freud would call that savage part of everyone that just wants to paraphrase the movie Jaws, eat, sleep, and make baby sharks, which is how he describes a great white shark. So it's nature versus the supernatural, good against evil. And this duality of human nature is the major theme that the novel explores. Like, how do we integrate, or can we ever, the good and bad sides of us, the savage id and the moral superego. The infamous Jack the Ripper cases, which were sadly real cases in which 6 women who were very poor and they were prostitutes, they were utterly mutilated by an unknown killer, still an unknown killer, known only as Jack the Ripper. These occurred in the Whitechapel district, in a very poor district of London in the 1880s. And it really shows that dual nature, because evidence really suggests that the murderer seemed to be a normal guy, right? What do they always say about serial killers? He was so quiet. He seemed so nice, right? Because whoever this horrible murderer was, he was able to convince these women to engage their services. He approached them. They were prostitutes, and they went with him willingly, not realizing that he was a crazy fiend, that he was a savage murderer. Let's talk about Victorian masculinity. So we have, so obviously Victorian England was a patriarchal society, and the ideal man in Victorian society was not a brute. It wasn't about being physically strong, but it was definitely about being strong in other ways. So a Victorian man was proud of his work. He was very much about his commerce and the money that he brought for his household. He was very protective of his household. Socially polite manners, presenting that public face, was very important in Victorian society. Upholding what is right and proper in the home and the family. They weren't weak, but they did not believe in expressing emotions, definitely. And here are some of the basic rules of social conduct, which would apply to men as well as women. You see this wonderful illustration, a suitor offering a bouquet to a young lady. So learn to govern yourselves and be gentle and patient. So self-control. Never speak or act in anger, more self-control. Remember that valuable as the gift of speech is, silence is more often valuable. So I love the phrasing of this. It's very 19th century. So sometimes better to just be quiet. Learn to speak in a gentle tone of voice. Learn to say kind and pleasant things when opportunity offers. Do not neglect little things if they can affect the comfort of others. So be concerned with the comfort of others. Learn to deny yourself and prefer others, and then beware of meddlers and talebearers. So mind your own business, basically. The class divide. So this we will definitely see in Jekyll and Hyde as well, that Jekyll is a rich man. That is why Dr. Jekyll and his friends, who are lawyers, right, has the time to meddle with scientific experiments because he's not spending every second of every day trying to get food and survive. So the rich, like Dr. Jekyll and his friends, are literate. They can read and write. They have had formal schooling. They had funds on which they lived, or like a family inheritance, or they worked as a doctor and a lawyer like Jekyll and his friends. They lived in luxury, they had servants, multiple houses. Class and status were made obvious through their clothes. You could tell how much money someone spent on their clothes, and it advertised, if you will, how rich they were. Gentlemen would wear a top hat, a greatcoat, carry a silk handkerchief, and a walking cane. And you see some elaborate Victorian gowns with bustles, this exaggerated rear protuberance. It's called a bustle. That was very popular in the 19th century. Now, the poor. If you get in a time machine and go back to the Victorian era, you want to be rich because it really sucked to be poor. There's no good time to be poor, but Victorian era certainly bad. There were millions of poor people who lived in terrible conditions. The streets were squalid, and they really starkly contrasted with the lives of the wealthy. Those boundaries between the rich and poor were very stark and obvious. Poverty in certain areas left people starving, children dying of disease, like cholera was a bad disease. In the sewer systems in Europe started to be improved in the 1840s, but you still had people dying from all kinds of communicable diseases. And as I mentioned earlier, there were millions of prostitutes in London, and not by choice, really. The great story Les Miserables makes that obvious. When it's a choice between starvation and prostitution, it's understandable that women would choose prostitution. There's a great line in the film The Year of Living Dangerously in which a character says, "Starvation is a great aphrodisiac," meaning obviously that it is not that prostitution has nothing to do with sex and everything to do with survival in the 19th century. The poor often wore clothes that didn't fit because they would take whatever they could get, and they'd also be dirty because they just didn't have places to wash their clothes themselves. Their clothes would get worn out and ratty and torn as well. So indigence and poverty. Indigent. Indigence is the state of extreme poverty. It means you really have nothing you don't have 2 cents to rub together. A varmint is a pest or a rascal. A pauper is a person relieving relief benefits welfare under Victorian poor laws. And so this cartoon says, "Pray, sir, have mercy on us and let us in, or give us some relief, for we are actually starving." "Then go and rob for your living, ye can't enter here. Be off, ye varmint." So Patrick Colquhoun, a political reformer in 1806, continued, "Indigence, therefore, and not poverty, is the evil." Being poor was not in itself evil. The poor could use whatever means available to survive. A farmer or a servant might be poor without being a pauper. So it was sadly believed that if you became a pauper, it was your own fault. It's like, well, you could just work harder. You could find some way to survive. God forbid you don't want to be on welfare. Ugh. So it was the indigent, the paupers, people who really were a burden to society. They were unable to survive without the help of charity. So there's no government uh, programs. These are all charity programs.